The Lost Track of Time, Chapter 3. The next day was very much like the one before, except for one thing: homework. Miss Roman didn't call it that. She called it a science project, but Penelope knew better. "This is the perfect thing for a workflow diagram," exclaimed her mother when she heard of the assignment. "We'll make one together right after dinner." Penelope cringed. How was she going to steal time to write if her mother kept crowding her schedule? As soon as the table cleared, her mother got busy breaking down the project into tasks and something called deliverables. Penelope had never heard of a deliverable before, but she had a pretty good idea what it meant. A deliverable must be something you delivered or turned in. Proof that you did something. Penelope thought about her checklist. Just wait. In a month, I'm going to turn in my own deliverable. The most amazing story ever. After identifying the project deliverables, her mother created a timeline. Penelope was shocked to see the entire week mapped out in tiny segments. It looked like her daily schedule, but blown up and stretched out. Was this the future? The future Penelope couldn't imagine? Instead of being wide open and full of possibilities, it was a series of little boxes. For the rest of the week, each night after dinner was devoted to the science project. All Penelope wanted to do was go to her room and write, but she told herself that keeping her mother happy would pay off in the long run. The only problem was that as soon as she finished one task, another one seemed to pop up. Penelope started carrying her small red notebook in her back pocket and used any spare time during science camp to write down story ideas, but none of them seemed good enough. It was odd. Ever since she started keeping better track of time, the less of it there seemed to be. The better she got at following her schedule, the busier it became. She was constantly checking the clock to make sure she didn't fall behind, but she fell behind anyway. On the last night of science camp, Penelope had to work through dinner and late into the night to finish her project. She crawled under the covers, exhausted from the day and ready for sleep. But when she closed her eyes, sleep wouldn't come. She tossed this way and that, her head full of worries about getting everything done. A month has passed and I still haven't written my story. Once I finish science camp, Mom expects me to work on those essay questions. Penelope flipped over onto her side. If I don't ace those essay questions, I'll never get a scholarship. Maybe I won't even go to college. But if I don't finish this story, I'll never be a writer. She flipped over onto her other side. Even if I were a writer, who would buy my stories anyway? I'd probably end up homeless, eating tuna out of a can. Somehow she managed to fall into a dreamless sleep, only to wake the next morning and start all over. It was the last day of camp, and Penelope's project won an honorable mention. Her mother was delighted, but Penelope was too tired to care. She moved through the next day and the days that followed on autopilot. By the time another week had passed, she was no closer to coming up with a story idea than before. Science camp was over, but Penelope's schedule was busier than ever. Now she was taking tennis lessons, learning Mandarin, and doing volunteer service hours at the museum in the afternoon. One morning, Penelope forced herself to wake up before the alarm. She dug out her notebook from under the bed and opened it. She stared at the page, willing herself to write. But for the first time ever, nothing came. Not even bad ideas. Her mind was blank. Not blank as in wide open, waiting for something wonderful, but blank like a wall. That's odd, thought Penelope. She usually had more ideas than she could keep track of. She got out a few old notebooks from under her bed and flipped through them. Detailed notes, elaborate doodles, long lists of words she'd collected, and half-written stories filled the pages. None of them looked familiar. She didn't even remember writing them. By now, she should be writing madly, dreaming up new characters and creating exciting plot twists. But she wasn't. She couldn't. Penelope heard her mother's heels clicking down the hall. She threw on her overalls, stuffed a pen in her red notebook in her back pocket, and ran downstairs to breakfast. "Good morning, sunshine," her mother chirped. "What'll it be?" "Just some cereal," said Penelope. She wasn't feeling hungry. She wasn't feeling anything. Once breakfast was laid out neatly, her mother sat down. "All right, then. Let's see what we have to look forward to today." She picked up the calendar and ripped off yesterday's date. Penelope braced herself for the little sigh her mother always made at this point. But she didn't sigh. Instead, she let out a gasp. Penelope put down her spoon. "What?" "Nothing," said her mother and sat back, stunned. "Nothing?" Penelope's mother nodded slowly. "Nothing what?" Penelope prodded. Nothing. That's just it. There's absolutely nothing on the calendar today." Penelope craned her neck to get a better look. There was the month, July, and the date, 3rd, and the quote. But after that, the calendar was empty. The quote said, "One today is worth 2 tomorrows." Penelope's mother frowned at the blank page. "Why is there a hole in your schedule? I'm certain I had you booked until school started." She flipped through the calendar. Sure enough, all the pages were crammed with tiny black notations. When she flipped back to the blank page, she noticed a tiny smudge on the corner. "The pages must have stuck together, and now you have nothing to do today," she complained, rubbing at the smudge with her thumb. This was what Penelope had been dreaming of. An entire day of nothing. Her mind started to race. Maybe her mother would give her the day off. After all, Penelope had been on time all day, every day, for weeks and weeks. A day off wouldn't hurt. She would sit at her desk, stare out the window, and... "All right," said Penelope's mother. "We'd better get busy." Penelope's mind came to a screeching halt. Busy? Doing what? What do you mean, doing what? You can't do nothing all day. A familiar knot of dread formed in Penelope's stomach. "Let's see," said her mother. "We'll start the day with another cooking lesson. You still haven't learned how to make chicken cordon bleu. Followed by ironing and Mandarin vocabulary drills. And this afternoon I'd like you to replant your tomato patch. Your rows are crooked. After dinner, I think you should take up knitting. How does that sound?" She looked at Penelope expectantly. One pencil-thin eyebrow raised as high as it would go. The knot in Penelope's stomach grew tighter. "Penelope, I said, how does that sound?" The knot moved from her stomach and into her throat. Penelope took a deep breath. "Can I have the day off instead?" she asked, pushing the words out as best she could. "Certainly not," her mother laughed. "But I've been on time for weeks and weeks." "Penelope, we've been through this before. There's not the least possibility you can have a day off and get everything done. Now, then, help me figure out what to do with the time slot after lunch." Penelope stared at her mother and reached for a pen, as her mother reached for a pen. "I know what. You can clean out all the junk under your bed. I've been wanting to do that for weeks." "What junk?" Penelope's voice was barely a whisper. Penelope's mother gave her an exasperated look. "You know what junk. Those broken toys, that useless hamster cage, not to mention those ratty old notebooks. The new school year begins soon. It's time for a fresh start, don't you think?" Penelope wanted to yell, "No!" but the knot in her throat wouldn't let her. Those weren't ratty old notebooks. Those were her stories. She'd been a fool to think she could fight fire with fire, and now her plan had gone up in smoke. Penelope watched, unable to move or speak, as her mother began to write. But just at that moment, the exact moment when pen touched paper, the doorbell rang. Ding dong! Oh dear, said her mother. Your father must have forgotten his key. She got up from the table and walked briskly toward the front door. As soon as her mother left the room, Penelope let out the breath she was holding, and her head began to clear. There was only one person who could save her notebooks, who could help save her notebooks, help save her dreams. Penelope had just a few seconds to act. It was now or never. She leaned forward, ripped the page out of the calendar, and stuffed it into her pocket. Then she slipped off her wristwatch and shoved it in a drawer before bolting out the back door. "How'd you get here?" said Miss Mattie when she found Penelope at her doorstep. "There's a hole in my schedule," said Penelope, panting. "How extraordinary!" Miss Mattie motioned Penelope inside, then closed the door. "Does your mother know you're here?" Penelope shook her head. "No, but I had to come. I've run out of ideas, and my mother is going to throw away my notebooks, and I'll never be a writer." "Ah," said Miss Mattie. "We'd better have some tea." When they got to the kitchen, Penelope sat down while Miss Mattie put on the kettle. After the stove was lit and the water was on, Miss Mattie joined her at the table. "So you've run out of ideas?" she asked. "I thought my parents would give me more time to write if I could prove my stories were important," explained Penelope. "I have to write something good, something amazing, but my mind is blank. I can't come up with anything. I've tried for weeks and now it's too late. My mother wants to throw away my notebooks. I've been writing in those notebooks for years. They're my inspiration. Without them, I'll never come up with a story idea. Never." Miss Mattie pursed her lips and stared out the window. Penelope stared with her. Usually staring out the window made her feel relaxed, but not this time. The scenery outside looked flat, like the backdrop of a play. Thwack! Miss Mattie slapped the table with her palm. Penelope sat up. "Space," she said. "Space?" asked Penelope. Yes, space. Maybe your ideas are stuck. Maybe they got crowded out and all you need is a little bit of," she fluttered her fingers around, space. Space. It sounded like a good idea. "Speaking of space," said Miss Mattie, "just how big is this hole in your schedule?" Penelope took the calendar page from her pocket and smoothed it out on the table. Miss Mattie leaned over. "Ooh, that's pretty big," she said, tapping the calendar page with her finger. Penelope nodded. "Watch out," said Miss Mattie. "You could fall into a hole like that." Penelope glanced up, expecting to see a twinkle in Miss Mattie's eye, but there was no twinkle, or wink, or even a smile. Miss Mattie was staring straight at her, a serious expression on her face. Just then the kettle screeched, and Miss Mattie got up. Penelope looked back down at the calendar page, with Miss Mattie's words lingering in her mind. You could fall into a hole like that. Penelope noticed the white of the paper looked brighter than before, and the little black lines seemed faded. The longer she stared, the fainter the black lines grew, until they disappeared altogether. That's odd, thought Penelope. She blinked and gave her head a little shake. The lines reappeared. Penelope looked over at Miss Mattie, who was spooning tea into the pot. "Tea will be ready in no time," Miss Mattie assured her. Penelope nodded and stole another glance at the page. It happened again. The paper seemed to glow for a moment. Penelope looked closer. The lines were definitely growing fainter. This time I'm not going to blink, she decided. Penelope kept her eyes open as wide as they would go. Sure enough, The white grew slowly brighter, and the black lines receded. Don't blink, don't blink. Penelope's eyes started to water, but she kept her resolve. The black lines had disappeared altogether, and even the white seemed to fade into nothing. Don't blink, don't blink. Now the room disappeared. The only thing Penelope could see was the paper, which didn't even seem to be there anymore. Instead, a warm white nothing opened out in front of her. Penelope felt like she was tottering at the edge of a pit. It made her feel queasy, so she blinked. And in that brief moment of darkness, the pit rushed up. Or else she fell down. Either way, Penelope heard a whooshing sound and felt a strong wind press against her face. She opened her eyes and flung out her arms to brace herself against the table, but there was no table. A jolt of panic sent Penelope's heart racing. Then the nothing engulfed her, and time slipped away into the rush of air.